Welcome to Criticaleye's Inspiring Leaders podcast. In this series, we're speaking to executive and non-executive directors about what's really going on in boardrooms today, getting insights into the key issues around strategy, stakeholder management, leadership capability, and boardroom dynamics. I'm Emily Jones, Senior Editor at Criticaleye, and today we'll be unpicking key takeaways across technology, stakeholder management, and board effectiveness from a recent piece of research conducted at the Criticaleye Chairs and NEDs retreat in 2024. Sharing his thoughts today is Criticaleye CEO Matthew Blagg. So welcome, Matthew. Let's start by talking through some of the top priorities that came out of this year's Criticaleye Chairs and NEDs research. At number 1, we have strengthening leadership capability, followed by new technology with a focus on AI at number 2. We then had improved business performance at number 3, retaining key talent and developing skills at number 4, and organisational design at number 5. I'd like to get your views on that. Is that reflective on what you've been hearing from boards and how they're operating in the current landscape?
So good afternoon, Emily, and thanks for having me on. Criticaleye's 21 years old, I think, now. I think those same 5 things could have been there 21 years ago. So in that sense, you could argue there's nothing revolutionary in those findings. I think what you've then got to do is unpick each one and look at what's going on underneath them all. And I think that's where it gets particularly interesting. I think the pace of change, the acceleration of these things, and then the contradictory elements of some of them, I think is getting really interesting. And I think what you're seeing is the differential between a great board and then one that isn't so great is creating an interesting opportunity, and then chaos in places where it isn't in the right place. So certainly if you look at it now, I think we're in a really interesting environment, and that alignment between the board dynamics and what their issues are, and then the operational environment that the operational team are in, I think is a really interesting zone right now.
Great, thank you. And do you think with this environment that we're in, that Chairs and NEDs need to find themselves closer to the business than they have been before?
The simple answer is yes. I think that there is a danger that they can become too close. I mean, I think that boards can become too involved in the business, and I think that's the interesting dynamic at the moment, that sort of balance between what's the right degree of challenge and support, what's the right degree of involvement, and what's the right degree of release. And I think that great boards have always got that balance right, of knowing when they should dial in and dial out. I think at the moment it is more difficult because the sort of speed of things coming at you, I think, is faster, and I think it can make you sort of naturally too involved, or feel that you're too remote. And I think that consistency of balance is really difficult. What I think you can absolutely say is that the involvement and the roles is now greater today than it was several years ago. There is no question you need to be more involved in the organisation physically. And so what you are seeing now at boards is that the pressure on their time is increasing, and the need for them also to have wider reference points, I think, is growing. So you're at a point where I think there is more pressure on boards today than there has been in recent times, not because of the economic landscape, but because of the physical demands of the role is increasing, and their need to have wider reference points, I think, is really important.
And if we can go into a little bit about what you mean about the physical demands of the role, what are we seeing? What are we specifically hearing from boards that they need to be dipping into more than ever?
I think that there's been a period where you could be on a board and you got reports that landed on your in tray. You sat at home, you were able to virtually go into an environment and feel that you really were sitting at a helicopter level, being able to really be connected to the organisation. I think there's a recognition to me that doesn't work. You've got to actually be physically there. So I think that great chairs now are demanding their non-executives or operationally pop up in the organisation at points. I mean, I was with a chair the other day who's divided their non-executives to regions and expects those non-executives to actually turn up in the regions that they represent, and so there is a real connectivity. And I think for any stakeholder, you want to feel that your board is passionate about the organisation they're in, and you can't have passion in a report. So I think generally there always has been chairs and non-executives who are connected to the purpose of the organisation are going to have greatest impact and resonate with that stakeholder environment. And I think that means you've got to spend more time than just the formal elements of when you come together or when you read the reports. You've really got to understand the landscape of the organisation that you're involved with.
Yeah, I mean, you hear that so often with the board mentors and board members that we speak to, where they have those important questions outside of the boardroom, and it's all it all meshes together, but it's not an isolated role. It is something that you need to be, doing outside of the strict boundaries, like you say. I know we talked about reporting requirements, but in terms of the data side of things, the insight side of things, do you think boards need more from the committee chairs than they have previously got in their role?
Again, I think to be controversial, I think there's a danger of over-involvement and over-analytical inputs. In some ways you've got a plethora of data. It's sort of, have you got the right data, and are you able to interpret it? And I think there's a really interesting... I was with a private equity CEO this week, and the discussion with him about was the competence of the organisation to understand risk. And I think that's true from a board perspective. I mean, you can have a risk committee and you can have a risk report, but do you actually really understand what the risk exposure is? Because that risk is your opportunity. And I think you can have a committee that has reports, or you can have a DNA around the table and through the organisation that really does understand. And I think what you're really looking for is that depth of understanding that isn't just in the data sets, but is also has an instinctive element and a wider connectivity point. And I think that's really important. What you are seeing is committees have more teeth, whether that's the audit committee, whether it's non-co. There is more pressure that's exuded through the roles. They've been uplifted, and I think that's really important, but it's for the right reasons, not because of a report or because of data sets. You've really got to understand the nuances of the organisation and the environment that you're in.
Right. And can you go into what you mean by they have more teeth?
Well, there is obviously, implications that if committees view things in certain ways, then it resonates. And so that is more formal. And I think that shareholders are looking for those committees to ensure that they are in the right place. So there's no question that the board itself has significant powers, and I think your stakeholders are looking at those to be enacted through the organisation. And the reality of it, that is real. There is legal implications that come of it, and so there is a reality behind the committees. I think that underneath that, though, it's the nuances of how they execute it that links to the way that they can support the executives towards a long-term positive outcome that's really important.
Yeah, great. And are you seeing these contrasts between PE-backed and publicly listed businesses at the moment?
There's always been contrasts, and always will be, because you can argue that the efficiency of private equity is you've got sort of smaller number of people who are very committed. Whereas obviously public markets are all wider stakeholder pieces. What I can tell you is that in a tight environment, and generally it's tight because interest rates being high means that sort of there is more pressure because the oxygen of business is more expensive. The pressure is universal whether you're a listed organisation or you're a private equity backed business. If you're top quartile, you're in a great place and your shareholders are pretty happy, and that's whether you're listed or private equity. If you're bottom quartile, you're pretty well done and dusted. If you're mid quartile, it really does come down to the competency of leadership, not necessarily the ownership structure. So if you're a highly competent leadership team that's private equity owned, you'll be getting the PE firm out. If you're a listed firm and you've got intrusive boards, you'll be pushing them out as well. So I think, again, it's the quality of your leadership that's really important there. If you get poor quality leadership in those environments, then I think boards can take over, whether that's in private equity or in listed environments.
Yeah. And speaking of leadership, we did a poll at the Chair and NED retreat in February where we asked about the psychological safety of executives and how often that was discussed on boards, and only 35% said it was. What's your take on that?
I think that's a massively high number. I don't think I've ever seen a time when it was discussed to a significant level. You can argue the COVID point, but the COVID point was a more surreal environment because everyone was going through their own personal. So when you talked about psychological safety, you were talking about a weirder personal element of were you physically safe. You weren't talking about the implications of the role and the pressure of it, which is what we're talking about in the current landscape. So for me, that it's even visible, I think shows you how much pressure there is around workload, the expectations. I think this combined element of stakeholders who are very vociferous at the moment, and then leadership, which is the danger of them becoming burnt out, I think is real. I think it's why you're seeing a lot of executives go plural, because they want to have more control of those implications, and there is then more executives coming through with less experience, and that again puts them into a more exposed position around psychological safety. And I think the positive on that statistic, I think it's great that boards are talking about it because I think it is real, and there's no question something that I think is going to continue to grow.
Yeah, so it's taking a step in the right direction.
I think so.
Given the degree of uncertainty at the moment, how do you think boards need to be working together to get alignment on those big issues around strategy, stakeholders and leadership, do you think?
I think that alignment's an interesting question because if you take the theory that everything's always moving, you're never going to be fully aligned. What I think there is a clear need to is to regularly come together and have bigger discussions about the forward strategy. I think when that gap gets bigger, I think that's when you have real challenges. I think it's making sure that there is real honesty between both sides. I think when there's gaming, I think that you lose sight of where you're going quite quickly. And I think that if I've got one challenge to non-executives at the moment and chairs, I think you can get cut away from the operational environment very quickly. And it's one of the real values of Criticaleye at the moment for non-executives is I think you really do need to be able to connect with the operational environment. And there is a danger that you become cut away from something at a point when I think that operational footprint's changing faster than I've ever seen. And that's only going to accelerate.
And that building alignment, that's one of the areas where boards are most looking to improve from the research as well. So you can see that there's that need that's coming through, but it's the struggle of sort of finding it, I suppose.
I think that it's simplistically everyone would articulate the need to be aligned. I mean, everyone would articulate that. But what that means, and in the context of, if you're a global organisation with multi-markets, what does that mean? You've got massive contradictions between the different components of it, and as it breaks down to an organisation, I think it's really difficult. And then you bring a consultancy firm in to tell you, how to get your strategy right, but then how does that land in the muck and the bullets of actually doing it? And then you're on a technology transformation, and you've got that's a lot of moving parts. So I don't think that's ever changed. What I do think at the moment, this is an environment where being simply articulating what you do becomes a real premium to all your stakeholder groups. And so I think you are seeing simplification. It's where I think that boards that are looking to divest businesses to really focus on their core becomes real. Being and all things to all people becomes very dangerous.
So it's kind of the struggle of defining it, I suppose, more so. If we move to talk about the stakeholders, shareholders and investors have been cited as the most challenging external stakeholders for Chairs and NEDs in this year's report. So we have that statistic coming through that 57% of NEDs say that senior teams become more short-term in their outlook due to the pressure to deliver to these stakeholders. As a CEO, how accurate do you see that in your view?
I think that there's an element, if you twist that statistic the other way, I don't think there's a board around that if the executives lose sight of the short-term indicators that they'd be supportive of the executive team. So the reality is the executive team have to be focused on short-term performance and deliver it. But that is, should be given.
Yeah.
The point is that good teams should be operating in a way that means that the leaders are able to focus on the long-term strategy And I think that there are times when boards have teams that are very operational and then struggle to get back towards a more long-term vision. I think it's really important. You can only sit as the leaders in an operational environment for a short period of time before it's a long-term barrier to success. So it's really vital that you are able to change that environment.
Mm-hmm. So the advice would be kind of to step away from that operational side for NEDs.
I think it's essential. I think you can step in crisis, but getting out is really important. And I think that can be particularly difficult for first-time non-executives because they've still got sort of one foot in the operational standpoint.
Yeah.
And I think that's particularly true in chairs when they've just transitioned from CEO, that element of really being independent. I mean, I had a conversation earlier today with a first-time executive chair of private equity-backed business, and you know, the reality of our discussion was how long are you executive chair before you got to go in one direction, or you either become a chair or you're really the CEO.
Yeah.
And so I think that balance is a pretty good one. I think that there's points when boards have to be very operationally involved when there is a crisis, but that should be a very short-term state.
Yeah, and it feeds into your point earlier about being close to the business, when to kind of step in and when to step out. We were looking at culture as well in the report, and 26% of chairs and NEDs reported that they had previously stepped down from a board role due to a dysfunctional culture. Does that number surprise you at all?
I was very surprised with that because I don't see that as often as I think I should, right. Being honest. I think that often non-executives don't walk from roles when I think they should, because they would expose some of the things. And if I can encourage any non-executives out there, I mean, you know, there was a question at the non-executive retreat, I think, that was asked of me around that specific component. And my general view is you do what you can to change it, and if you can't, you get out, because I think there is a point where you're part of the problem. So I think it's interesting that the numbers are as high as that. I think it's probably a good statistic. I think it, you know, in some ways, in a world that's changing faster, non-executives recognising they're not having impact and walking away from the role, I think it's a really healthy thing.
Yeah, great. And with these tensions, do you think there's a role for the senior independent director to step in more? Is there a place for that?
Definitely. The SID's role is to be a check and balance and ensure that if there is a gap between members of the board or the executive and the chair, that there is someone who can play a role, and also that shareholders can go to and have that dialogue. So I think it's an extremely important role. And if Dre Brown was listening, he'd be saying, "Always has it been thus," and it's about finding the right person. I think that it is also a stepping zone for non-executive to chair. So it is an opportunity to develop chair competencies and skills. So I think it's a really important role.
Yeah. And another area we looked at was hot on the minds of everyone at the moment, AI and machine learning. That is a very high priority for chairs and NEDs this year, and 70% of participants cited new technology as being the biggest driver of transformation, unsurprisingly. And the pressure for organisations is greater than ever to be ahead of the curve. Do you think that boards and execs are meeting the demands of new tech, and what needs to be done for organisations to effectively keep in line with the market as it stands?
So I think first of all, most boards would articulate that they're behind from a technology perspective, because by its very nature, your operational footprint immediately you create it is outdated. So you're constantly on an evolution. I think where boards line up is where you've got innovation that is quite easy to qualify and visualise. I think where there is still a disparity, the organisational structures, I think, lag. So I think there is often quite a mature debate around technology deployment, which is innovative. I think there is less mature debate around the organisational machinery, which I think is generally poor quality and actually getting worse, would be my observation. And I think that great organisations are able to balance those two things in a stronger way, and recognise the difference between sort of real evolution and revolution, because I think there is a balance between the two.
Mm-hmm. Do you think there's a wariness around this because of the cyber risks that you're hearing about? Do you think there's a hesitancy because of that aspect?
I was with a listed CEO the other day, and we were discussing the sort of challenge around the board table between the non-executives who don't think the business is fast enough and taking enough risk, and then the non-executives who feel that there is much too much risk because of all of the cyber, and I think that's probably a healthy blend of the challenge, and I think that risk is opportunity until it's a threat, and so I think the balance on all that is really, really important. It's very easy to say after the event that you understood what the risk process profile really was, but I do think you are under more pressure with regard to the balance between opportunity and real risk.
Right. And from your side, are there any looming issues, do you think, that are going to move up the board agenda in the coming months?
I mean, the two big things that are on everyone's in tray at the moment is the interest rate issue, which I think is schizophrenic at the moment and probably going back into a more negative position today as we talk in April. In March, I think generally people thought the interest rates were coming down. I think in April they look as though they might stay for longer, and I think that is a significant issue. Because ultimately that's going to have an implication on deal flow, valuations, and so that I think is the most important issue on it from a global perspective. And then you've got the element of significant geopolitical changes. Next week I'm in Asia. It will be the number one issue around there, and the sort of tectonic plates of on a global level, what the implications are, and then bringing that back down into a local environment. So I don't think the geopolitical is just about the big global position. It also comes back into local politics. So I think that piece is more important. And I think the role of regulatory role and society implications is only going to grow over the next 12 to 24 months.
So perhaps should do this again in a few months and see where we're at.
Well, the fun thing, if you take the reality of generally people going to leadership because of challenge, there is not a lack of challenge right now. What I do think is it means that individuals who are not putting themselves and exposing themselves to where things are changing, how they're changing, I think are going to degrade very fast. I think you've got to be very connected. You've got to have much wider reference points, and you've got to be really challenging yourself. And I think that's really important, but particularly if you go non-executive, because I think there is a danger that you end up in a group of individuals who are in the same place, and I don't think that's ever healthy. But particularly at the moment, very unhealthy.
Yeah, and that connectivity has come across in the research too, because there's been a overwhelming need for those external reference points, as you say. That's cited as the second area of improvement for Chairs and NEDs. So why, you went into this a little bit before, but why do you think it's important for Chairs and NEDs to have that curiosity and that hunger for external insights?
I think that just take a base level of the pace that society globally is changing, the pace of technology, and I've got a young child. And in some ways that keeps me more grounded than anything, because you see the world from that angle. I think if you sit in an environment where you're aging and you're in an environment where you've got affluence around you, it's quite difficult to really empathise with how the world's changing. And from my mind, that piece is the single most important thing to be current, but it is the most difficult when you have more or you sit in a more comfortable environment. And so I think that historically, and I don't think this is any different to when we set Criticaleye, the people that you admire are the people who are still able to put themselves in places where they're exposed. As you get into a more senior environment, that can become more difficult, but still it's very much there. And it's 90% attitude, but it is easier when you become more senior to actually forget where you've come from. And I think that's the most important thing in my mind.
With the research, there's been an overwhelming recognition for Chairs and NEDs to have those external reference points, as you say, as this was cited as the second area of improvement for Chairs and NEDs. Why do you think it's important for them to have this curiosity and hunger for the external reference points and insights?
I think that in an environment where the pace of change accelerates, you've got to push yourself to be open to having different views and ways of doing things, and a peer environment where you can openly share. And I think we see, from our Chair Ready programme, that step up into the chair role and that chair environment. There's more pressure. There's a danger that you don't have those reference points and you become isolated, more so today than ever. And so that benchmark, that peer environment becomes, I think, massively important. The implications of getting it wrong are only going to grow.
Okay, thank you. I'm afraid that's all we have time for today, but thank you so much to my guest, Matthew Blagg, for joining me on this episode. And if you'd like to find out more about Criticaleye's Inspiring Leaders podcast, you can find all the episodes streaming now on Podbean or Spotify. Thank you so much.